Greetings, my name is Leah Friedman, and this is my book, The Unexpected Adventure of Growing Old. T.S. Eliot once wrote that old men ought to be explorers. As an old woman, now almost 90, I see my later years as a fascinating exploration of unknown territory, including enrolling in Pacifica at 69 and receiving my PhD in mythological studies at 73. This, my third book, written in the past decade, grew out of my desire to share some experiences and observations regarding old age seen from a more positive, though realistic, perspective. There is a gracious blurb by Chris Downing on the back cover. In our youth-oriented society, we're told that growing old is something to dread, that it's all about decline and disease and debility, that it's about loss and pain and sorrow. Old age is, of course, about those things, but it's also about exploring new ideas, developing new skills, making new friends, just deepening our spiritual outlook. I'm convinced that by embracing our aging, adjusting to its changes, and focusing on the advantages it can bring, we can transform ourselves in the process. The years 65 to 85 were among the most rewarding of my life. There are challenges, of course, living in a culture that values youthfulness, vigor, and unblemished beauty. We frequently encounter ageism. We know what it is to be ignored, dismissed, patronized. One of my pet peeves is to be called young lady. In my curmudgeonly way, I'm likely to respond that I am not young and I am not a lady. I'm a proud old woman. I wish to free that word old from its negative associations and define it as a stage of life. In my book, I describe some metaphors about growing old that view this stage of life from a symbolic or archetypal perspective. Jung compared our lives to the daily passage of the sun. Other metaphors relate to the seasons, to ripening fruit, to a journey, or viewing our lifespan as a river. These images help us understand the broad scope of our lives and enable us to view our later years from a fresh, enriched vantage point. Old age is made up of several stages. We're not the same in our 60s as we are in our 70s and 80s. Awakened to new possibilities, in my 60s, I began conducting rituals and became interested in Jungian psychology. I began working with a Jungian analyst, where a series of recurrent dreams pointed my way to Pacifica. In our 70s, the middle stage of aging, we're likely to face some serious problems. Just as I got my degree, my husband was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Our daughter became seriously ill. I learned many important lessons during this period, including how essential it is to develop patience, acceptance, and a kind of detachment, allowing us to see things from a larger perspective, qualities that can serve us well in our later years. Old people are often accused of being staid, stubborn, and unable to make change. Actually, there is no other age group required to make so many extreme alterations in their habitual way of living. There are changes in our bodies, in our families, in our living arrangements. These adjustments are not easy, but many of us old people are resilient, making the best of our changing circumstances. As we enter our 80s, which I call the age of fulfillment, we're likely to be left alone, to experience the solace of solitude, while recognizing there are dangers in being too lonely or isolated. At this stage, we have more time for contemplation, which allows us to be in touch with our essential self, that core being which is strengthened when we focus on our inner rather than our outer concerns. As I mentioned, it's time to deepen our spiritual outlook, to search for contentment, for reconciliation, and a sense of completion. In the more than a decade since my husband's death, I have found a renewed sense of self. I've made new friends, found new interests, and working on my fourth book, as well as having had 2 knee replacements. An inevitable aspect of aging is our eventual death, a subject that's like the elephant in the room, all too frequently ignored. In my final chapter, I share perspectives and information regarding end-of-life issues. It's important to talk about this topic and to do all we can to prepare ourselves and our families for our eventual demise. Regarding death, Jung wrote that, quote, "We are so convinced that death is simply the end of a process that it does not ordinarily occur to us to conceive of death as a goal and a fulfillment, as we do without hesitation the aims and purposes of youthful life in its ascendance," unquote. If we could look at our eventual departure from this perspective, perhaps we would have less fear and instead celebrate the great gifts that life has given us. Perhaps you can relate to the last paragraph of my book, which reads, "It is as if I am more alive than ever before. I'm extraordinarily fortunate, for I feel infused with unexpected vigor and vitality, giving me an unparalleled sense of well-being. As I live through my final time upon this beautiful, imperiled earth, I rejoice in the life I have lived. It's been a marvelous, fulfilling adventure, one I could never have imagined. What a privilege it is to grow old."